My name's Emma Dawson. I'm Executive Director at Capita, which is a public policy think tank for those of you who don't know us. And I'm going to be chatting today with Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers. I'd like, first of all, to acknowledge that we're all on Indigenous land. Myself, I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Victoria. Jim, as I understand it, is on the land of the Yugambeh and Yagara people up in Queensland. Wherever you are and whatever land you're on, I know you'll join me in paying respect to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging, and recognising that this is Aboriginal land that was never ceded. So as I said, my name's Emma. I'm going to be chatting today to Jim Chalmers. And for those of you who haven't participated in Australia at Home before, this is a relaxed space where we share ideas and support each other during what are fairly remarkable, strange times. A few basics: turn your video on and switch your screen to gallery so that you get anyone who's with us today. Use the chat function to introduce yourself, and as the discussion proceeds, to ask any questions you'd like to ask. We'll be calling on some of you to talk to Jim directly. And finally, the sessions are recorded, so please keep yourselves nice. I'm sure you all will. So Jim, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me, Emma. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and we always Peter always starts these sessions by asking, how are you going during these strange times?
Well, I think for everyone, it's a bit of a mixed bag, isn't it? I haven't spent so much time with my kids for a long time, but obviously it's very challenging, and the policy environment's incredibly challenging and keeps us all engaged and busy. Yeah,
same. I'm finding the managing my own workload and the home education definitely a challenge at the moment.
Right.
We'll get through. So Jim, we're talking today about the situation we find ourselves in, the economic ramifications of that. I just wanted to kick off by getting your views of the government's response so far, both state and federal government responses, and what you think will be needed in the future, because in my view, we haven't seen stimulus spending yet. What we've seen so far is really life support spending for the economy, and the stimulus is going to be needed after this. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, Emma. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. What's happening now is really triage in the economy, trying to prevent as many job losses as possible. I think the government has taken some pretty welcome steps. Some of them we called for and they responded to. That's a good thing. And when you think about wage subsidies, when you think about cash transfers to the most vulnerable people in our society, obviously those are good steps that the government's taking. And they're not the most enthusiastic interventionists in the economy, and so in lots of ways I think it's a good thing that they've come to that view, because the times warrant some pretty substantial outlays, if you want to call it that. There are obviously some issues as well, and the approach that we've taken as the opposition is to say, how can we be as constructive and responsible and supportive as possible, at the same time as we recognise that being constructive doesn't mean being silent. So if there are obvious gaps, or if there's a lack of urgency in getting some of this support out the door and into people's pockets, then we've taken it on ourselves really to highlight those issues. And the really obvious one now is in those otherwise welcome JobKeeper wage subsidies. Clearly there's an issue that the government has deliberately left out more than 1 million casuals and other workers as well. And so what we've been saying is the Treasurer actually has the power to change the rules around eligibility with the stroke of a pen. And so we've been saying to him, if you do that, that'll be a good outcome. Because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to maintain a link between workers and their employers through this really difficult period. That's a worthy objective, but if it's worthy for some workers, it should be worthy for more workers as well. And so I think that's the main gap with what's being proposed so far. Clearly, we'll get to the point where we'll need some, stimulus for the kind of 6, 9, 12-month period ahead. And there are some obvious contenders there that the government should be looking at. Clearly people think there's a need and an opportunity to do things like social housing. Clearly people are interested in renewable energy projects. Clearly there's a role for local government and small-scale infrastructure and maintenance. And so ideally, as the government is going about putting in place this near-term triage, they need to also be thinking about, how do we keep the place growing towards the end of the year and into 2021?
Yeah, great. I think they're all really important things that we need to start talking about now. I think the initial weeks of the crisis were obviously the big focus was protecting people's lives and health. But as we start to see Australia kind of coming through quite well, so so far, I think it is timely to start having that conversation. I wanted to raise with you one thing I saw this morning. Samantha Maiden had a piece reporting on some problems workers are having with getting JobKeeper, and the lack of kind of oversight of the system. It's sort of based on the goodwill or the trust of an employer to make sure that they pass that through. And I've certainly heard myself a few anecdotal stories in that regard as well, mainly in smaller businesses whose workplaces aren't unionised. And of course, the Prime Minister's response was to say, well, go to the Fair Work Ombudsman, go to the Fair Work Commission. But that's, people might lose their job if they do that. So,
well, he's a well-known supporter of fairness in the workplace, Emma, so he's a big supporter of the Fair Work Commission.
Yeah. I think one of the issues there is a lack of, within that legislation, there is a sort of a lack of oversight of how that relationship between employers and employees are going to work. Is that something you've had a chance to think about much?
Clearly that's an issue, and we get a lot of feedback from constituents and people from right around the country. And obviously there are going to be things which need to be ironed out in the legislation. That's one of the reasons why we gave the Treasurer those powers to fix things as we go. But there are some issues around whether the workforce is all in or not. There are some issues around forcing people to take annual leave while companies are still receiving the payment. That's a big problem. There's issues around partnerships. There's a whole range of things that we've been hearing about and encouraging the government to fix either publicly and privately in the channels that we have available to us. So that is an issue. But the other thing which I think will be really important, especially when you consider that the government itself via Peter Dutton said that there will be rorting of this program. It's really important that we empower that Senate committee, which is chaired by my colleague, Katie Gallagher, to make sure that we do get to the bottom of these issues, ideally soon enough that they can be fixed. But also because when you are outlaying $130 billion of Australians' money, you want to make sure that you're getting maximum bang for buck, that you're achieving all of the objectives that you want to achieve. And so that committee, I think, will be really important in regard to that problem that you mentioned and some of the other problems too.
Great. Look, before we, I'm going to throw to some questions shortly and then come back and have a further chat. But I think one of the things that I know you and I both agree on, and I think most people that are really aware of the economic issues and particularly the labour force issues in the country are aware of, is that the economy wasn't in great shape going into this crisis. We had, a high level of casualisation of the workforce, and we're seeing that now of just the sheer number of people left out of JobKeeper because they've been in a casual role for less than 12 months. We had high levels of temporary migration. Those workers aren't included. But also, we've had a lot of slack in the labour market. We've had a lot of underutilisation, underemployment, and a higher unemployment rate than comparable advanced nations going in as well. Also a lack of business investment, a lack of productivity growth due to a lack of business investment. Is that the kind of economy we want to snap back to?
Well, obviously not. I mean, that's really one of the big issues which has not been sort of sufficiently interrogated as we talk about what the economy looks like now, what it looked like before. There's not enough recognition that for a lot of people, the economy that we had even before this crisis was defined by underemployment, as you rightly point out, insecure work, precarious work. What we're seeing now is the kind of human cost of casualisation. And so there are all of those issues. And for those, largely because of those reasons, people had stagnant wages, declining living standards. There just wasn't the spending power in the economy that we needed to see. So growth was actually remarkably sluggish even before the crisis hit. And so when the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, they talk about snapback, I think for a lot of Australians, they would like to think, and they've got a right to expect something better than what we've seen for the last few years in the economy. And I think, if anything, you think about all the things that this crisis has changed. It's made people realise how precarious their financial system is. It's made them reconsider what's essential. It's made them reconsider their work-family balance. all of these sorts of things that have been reconsidered, I think it will shine a light on the fact that people were living insecure work lives before this crisis hit. And we owe it to them to put employment and jobs at the centre of how we reimagine the economy after the crisis.
You're singing my tune there, Jim. We feel pretty strongly about full employment at per capita. I'm going to throw to a couple of questions and comments now. I know our mutual friend Michael Cooney's on the line and has some insight to offer from his experience about those people walking the system. Hi, Michael.
G'day. Yeah, I know at Morris Blackburn, our industrial lawyers are already getting more than one complaint and more than one case already where the employers, and as you say, often small ones, but not only, and it certainly won't always be small ones, are either trying to keep the wage themselves, trying to keep the subsidy themselves and not pass it through, or asking people, as the Sam Maiden piece points to today, having people who were earning less than the total amount of the subsidy being asked to work more hours, effectively for no extra work, for no extra pay for them. And it was apparent in the last day or so that the Prime Minister in his comments really didn't understand the application of it. And it's certainly a very complex measure, which looks like that creates room for abuse as well. So that's something that we're already seeing. I wonder where it strikes me as an interesting example. I'd be interested to ask Jim his view on this question about the rhetoric of Team Australia is being used pretty cynically, it feels like, to try to get progressive people and civil society to buy into some pretty conservative agendas. And I wonder whether you've given any thought to what our kind of counter ask is, in a sense, rather than it just being about amazingly, tax cuts and industrial relations reform. And notably superannuation, where we're seeing damaging changes being pushed through under Team Australia.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael, for that. You know, I do think that at times like these, the expectations on the political system from the community is a bit higher in terms of seeing where we can work together, seeing where we can find common ground. And, you know, most people are watching this kind of national cabinet process to see if it can work. And those of us who are long-term supporters, including yourself, of kind of a more emboldened COAG process, that's something that we're watching carefully as well. I am a bit worried that, as you say, the Team Australia becomes another way that the Conservatives kind of divide people. You know, you're either in the cart for all of the things that they want to do, or you're outside the cart and therefore, you know, not playing for Team Australia. I think that is a potentially damaging kind of rhetorical advance. And we don't want to see this crisis just be an excuse for the government just to dust off all of their old ideological obsessions and then drawing on this period of, you know, genuinely and generally, national unity to try and staple those things together and pretend that they're one and the same. I think you can be part of Team Australia and believe that, that's when we say that we're all in this together, we have to mean it. It's not just about getting through the crisis. It's about trying to think about what the best version of ourselves is after the crisis as well, what the new Australia looks like afterwards. And I've done some writing and thinking on that. And I know Anthony Albanese and others of my colleagues are spending a lot of time thinking about what the country looks like, because we do have a moment here where we can build on, if we do a good job on the health front, as it appears that we're doing so far, if we do a reasonable job on the economic front, and that remains to be seen, then we will have a foundation to build from. And we will have a sense that Australia is capable of more than what we've seen in the last 6 or 7 years.
Thanks, Jim. I'm going to throw to, I think Denise Trevel's on the line, and she had an interesting question about how we talk about this, which sort of builds on what we were just saying. Denise, are you there?
Yes, I'm going to keep myself off screen though. I'm doing my exercise at the moment.
Multitasking.
Multitasking as you do. Yes, I very much see the government already starting to divide Team Australia versus those of us that won't agree with their clear neoliberal agenda, are going to be outside that tent and therefore probably undermined. How do you plan to, I suppose, push that further vision And as Emma knows, I also think a lot about the media landscape that we have to navigate our way through to get that alternative vision through. It's really challenging.
Yeah, you're right, Denise, and it's nice to hear from you. You're I see you regularly on my Twitter feed, so it's nice to put a voice to the Twitter handle.
Thank you.
Look, well, a couple of parts about that. I mean, the responsibility for us in the Labor opposition is, first of all, to make sure that the response is as robust and broad and effective and comprehensive as it can be, and I think we've been doing that, and Anthony in particular has been doing a terrific job of that. That's our job in the near term. But as I wrote in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago, a piece that talked about how it's not too early to think about what the place looks after, which is a bit like what I said in response to Michael's question a moment ago. And clearly we need to have an alternate vision, not just for the economy, but for the society more broadly. And that means demonstrating to people that we can grow the economy and create good, well-paid jobs for people and have that inclusive and sustainable growth, which is conscious of the environment, conscious of our responsibilities to each other, that we can tell an alternate story to what the government is proposing, something that people can buy into, a story that people can see themselves as part of. That's our responsibility in the Labor Party, and that's what we're working on. Clearly, the media environment can be challenging from time to time, but there are opportunities for us as well. And so the way I come at that is to take as many opportunities, frankly, as we can to tell our story and to put our side of the story. There will be, obviously the usual suspects, which will be critical no matter what we say. But our job is to reach as many Australians as we can and tell a story that includes them in it. If we do that well, then we'll be well positioned, not just to win an election, but to kind of win the future, to win the argument about what Australia should look like down the track.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think if I can give a bit of a shameless per capita plug here, we put a paper out on Monday called Some Facts About Debt, which talked about that need for an alternative vision to austerity measures, and an alternative vision that involves exactly that, building a sustainable, equitable economy that can create really good, strong, well-paid and secure jobs in the years ahead. And I think the argument that we're trying to make there is the threat to our children's future, the intergenerational threat, isn't the debt itself, it's how we respond to it and whether we choose to grow and support our economy or to cut things to try to pay off that debt. So I want to talk to you a little bit about debt, and I can see from some of the questions here, we've got a few modern monetary theory enthusiasts on the stream today, who of course don't like it when I use the word debt because they don't believe there is any problem with debt, and you and I have a slightly different view to that. The debt is big. The debt we've taken on is big, and it's rightly big. We've needed to do that. It's been an extraordinary crisis, and I think we're in agreement there'll need to be more borrowing on the other side of this to get the economy back up and running. My thesis in the report we put out on Monday is that we best do that by through growth and through sustainable growth. What's your view on the debt, on the size of the debt, on what we need to do to address it, and also to ensure people have a good standard of living and our kids aren't, being punished for this for generations? Yeah.
Look, I mean, self-evidently, there will be a massive amount of debt in the budget when we get through this. Period, that's just that is a fact, and that will have to be repaid in some form or another in time. But what we've said repeatedly, and why I think this has become such a hot button part of the conversation is economics and policy making is about priorities, and our highest priority is to save lives, of course, in the first instance, but save jobs as well and support communities. And that's been our highest priority, throughout this crisis. And so that will inevitably attract, a whole bunch of debt. I don't think it's the most important thing right now, but I think it still matters. I think the amount of debt that we have in the budget does matter. I know that's not a view shared by perhaps everybody on this call, but I think it does matter. And one of the reasons I think it matters is that because even before this crisis hit us, we were expecting to pay about $17 billion in servicing the debt out of the budget, off the bottom line of the budget. And clearly, I think everybody on this call could think of better uses of $17 billion worth of Commonwealth money than servicing that debt. And one of the things that people don't necessarily appreciate is that debt hasn't just sort of spiked, in the last month or two, but it's actually more than doubled over the life of this Conservative government. And so that clearly changes the way that people talk about debt too, given most of these characters, the Cormans and the Frydenbergs and the like, have spent, a decade or more saying that it was wrong that Australia accumulated much less debt during the GFC. And so it's changed the dynamics of the conversation. I don't think it's the most important thing right now. The most important thing right now is jobs. But I think it does matter in the medium term and longer term. And the most important part of your question, in my view, is if we accept that it has to be repaid, then where does the burden of that fall? And the most important priority there is to make sure that the most vulnerable people don't pay a disproportionate price for this debt, which is sort of the instinct often of the Liberals and Nationals. And so the final point I'd make about it, Emma, I think, is that we welcome the fact that the government has learned some of the lessons of 2008-9, that there's a role for government intervention in crisis times. There's a role for cash payments and boosting demand. But we're not sure yet whether they've learned the lessons of 2014-15, when they had that horror budget that largely destroyed the Abbott-Hockey government, which was an austerity budget. It asked the most vulnerable people to carry the heaviest burden. And we don't know yet whether they've learned the lesson of that budget. We hope that they have, but it remains to be seen.
Thanks, Jim. I know our friend Stephen Koukoulas is on the line today, and I reckon Stephen's probably got some interesting insights about debt as well that might be a bit provocative to some of our MMT friends. So I'm going to let Stephen be provocative now. Are you there, Stephen?
I've got my screen covered. Apologies. I'm not well.
You're exercising too.
Yeah, I'm not exercising. No, not at the minute. Look, debt matters when it matters. I suppose that's a crazy thing to say in a sense. But the interesting thing that Jim touched on there was that the luck, if you like, of the coalition in the last 6 or 7 years as gross debt, I'll focus on for the moment, has increased from 270 billion to what are we, to 590, on our way to 800 or 900 billion in the next couple of years, is that it's been with very low interest rates. Every time they've issued more debt, the bond yield has been ratcheting lower over the course of those 6 or 7 years. So they've been saved from that burden. And Jim, you mentioned the point that there's roughly $17 billion of debt servicing costs at the moment. And while interest rates are low on the new debt they're issuing, the debt interest cost is still a couple of $1 billion a year on, say, an extra 300 billion, which looks to be what they're going to be raising in the next few years. So the debt servicing cost is $2 billion. So yeah, very quickly, even with interest rates where they are, the interest bill for your first budget in 2022, Jim, will have about $20 or $21 billion going into interest costs. And that is if interest rates stay where they are. Now, we've all been around long enough to see a lot of unexpected things happen in the last decade. The GFC, this virus itself, Brexit, Trump, things that, gosh, you couldn't have imagined, really.
Right.
Will interest rates be 2 or 3 percentage points higher when you're treasurer, Jim, and you've got to fund $1 trillion of debt servicing obligations with yields at 3 or 4%? I don't know. It's a precarious position that prudent management would guard against.
Thanks, Stephen. And look,
Thanks, Emma.
Again, I would direct people to the Per Capita paper on Monday called "Some Facts About Debt." It doesn't suggest that we shouldn't worry about debt at all, but it does try to put it in a little bit of perspective. And I think Jim's point is the critical one, which is debt does matter, but it's not the most important thing coming out of this crisis. The most important thing will be jobs, restoring the employment of Australians, and actually making it creating a lot more secure jobs, addressing underutilisation and underemployment as well. And so,
can I just make one additional point there, Emma, as well? Sorry to chop you off, but I think we should also, collectively acknowledge the issue with private debt.
Yep.
Coming out of this. I mean, we already had record levels of household debt before the crisis. It was one of those challenges that you were referring to before. And clearly, you know, people are going to wake up in, you know, November or December, around the time when Scott Morrison says everything would have snapped back to normal, which I'm sceptical about. And people will obviously be carrying a heap of debt, you know, whether they've deferred some repayments, whether they've taken on extra debt to get through a difficult period. And so I think it's helpful to consider that it's the two parts of debt together as well, and recognising that, you know, public debt will be something that future governments will have to grapple with. But really in almost every home around Australia, they will be dealing with an issue with their own household debt, a problem that existed before but will be accelerated now.
Yep, I think it's an excellent point. I mean, our public debt's quite low by OECD standards. It's only around 20%. Our household debt, our private debt's sky high. It's amongst the highest in the world, if not the highest in the world. And, you know, people won't be spending into the productive economy if they're servicing that debt with a reduced income. So I think it's a really important point. Thank you. I'm going to throw to Dee Madigan now, who's a friend of ours and a board member at Per Capita, who I think has a question for Jim.
Yes. Now, Jim, you've talked about the fact the government did introduce a stimulus, even though they had to be dragged kicking and screaming, and that should obviously be widened to include casuals and people in different sectors that it currently, hold on guys, George, that it doesn't currently include. But what are some of the measures you think should be taken post-virus to stimulate the economy?
Yeah, thanks, Dee. And it's, as I said before, it is a welcome kind of change of heart. You know, the government, you know, even sort of a week before they did the wage subsidies, they were saying that it wasn't a good idea. They were dismissing it. And I think the broader kind of Labor movement did a good job making the case for it. And eventually they came around. That's a good thing. But that is some of these measures, you know, are part of the story, but not the whole story into the kind of the next 6, 9, 12 months. And so I think those things that I was referring to earlier, you know, is there a way that we can, you know, get energy costs down for businesses and households by investing more in renewable energy? Is there a way that we can, you know, recognise that social housing, whether it's stock or maintenance or whatever, would be a good way to keep the place, you know, ticking along over a certain period? You know, clearly there's an appetite to do more to have a broader economy where we've got, you know, kind of a revitalised manufacturing sector. I think all of these things are important together. The role of research and innovation and science is obviously underdone in our economy, and I think we're kind of finding that out now as well. So I guess the whole point of broadening the conversation about economic growth out beyond, you know, the kind of, you know, the government's obsession with industrial relations and headline company tax cuts and red tape reduction, is to say that there is more than one way to grow the economy. We can do it in a way that distributes opportunity more effectively. We can do it in a way that gets emissions down and gets energy costs down, all of those sorts of things. And so that's the thinking we should be doing now. As we monitor the kind of rollout of this welcome stimulus, we need to work out what we're doing to support the economy, you know, through 2021 and 2022. A lot of people on the call would have seen or read about what the Governor of the Reserve Bank said yesterday, Philip Lowe. He gave quite an impactful speech, and what he talked about was the kind of long tail of this problem. And the economists on the call will appreciate that the unemployment rate is notorious for rising much quicker than it falls. And so there's every chance we'll have a long tail here, where the economy will be weaker than is ideal, and the labour market will be much weaker than is ideal. And so we need to be working out, you know, how we boost growth in that over that period as well. Also, the other thing to recognise, which is a little bit kind of techie, but it's important, is if the government does start withdrawing some of these near-term payments, then unless they're replaced with private spending or some other kind of stimulus, they will actually detract from growth as they come out of the economy. And I'm not sure that the government is sufficiently alive to that when they talk about snapback and they pretend that everybody's going to wake up in November or December and everything's going to be fine again. I don't think they really appreciate that how that stimulus is withdrawn is almost as important as how it was introduced in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Of course, if it's withdrawn too quickly, before the private sector's in any shape to step up, we're going to see a lot more pain. look, one of the things that the government's hinting at, of course, with their, snapback rhetoric and the need for, I think what they said, different economic settings coming out this the other side, is already resulting in things like, fairly radical changes to the industrial relations system through the regulation they moved to reduce EBA bargaining consultation times from 7 days to 1. I imagine there's a strong push already to increase the GST, to give business tax cuts and so on in the hope that will stimulate the economy. I know Ewan Black's on the line from the New Daily, and he's got some questions in that area as well. So I'm going to let Ewan ask his question before I get you to respond to these issues, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Have I got the mic on okay? It's my first Zoom, so...
We can hear you.
Yep, we can hear you. Yep.
Yeah, Jim, my question's kind of, Dee kind of asked a similar question. Just kind of wanted to get your response to, Treasurer's comments this morning, flagging big business tax cuts and industrial relations reform as kind of some of the key areas they're looking at. He's ruled out a hike in GST. So just kind of interested in getting your thoughts on that, given that, Philip Lowe yesterday said that reforms to the way that we tax income generation, consumption and land, they should be like key government priorities. So yeah, what are your thoughts on the Treasurer's comments? And also beyond the kind of short term, what are some of the key areas of focus for you in terms of driving growth over the longer term?
Yeah, thanks, Ewan. I saw the Treasurer's interview this morning about the GST on ABC Breakfast with Michael Rowland, and I think Michael did a good job pointing out to him that saying that there are no current plans to jack up the GST is not quite, refusing to contemplate it at some point in the future. Look, I think that we obviously wouldn't be in the cart for an increase in the GST. It's hard to see the government having the appetite to compensate particularly low-income earners sufficiently. We're worried about the kind of distributional impact of a hike in the GST. The other thing which seems to be sort of unfortunately forgotten is every dollar of that would go to the states, of course. And so if the government was going to do that for budget repair at the Commonwealth level, they'd have to claw back some of the other partnerships and payments that they make to the states. And that's not, often recognised, that it's every dollar of what's raised by the GST goes to the states. In terms of the other agendas, whether it be company tax cuts, industrial relations, or, in the red tape area, I think it would be disappointing but not especially surprising if the government tried to use this crisis as an excuse to kind of dust off all of their old ideological obsessions, all of their anti-union rhetoric, all of their anti-worker industrial relations proposals. And we have seen that, as Emma mentioned, in the change to that regulation that Tony Burke and other colleagues have done such a good job pushing back against. We can't, and in superannuation, as Stephen Jones and others have pointed out, that using this as an opportunity to undermine superannuation, I think these are disappointing developments. And you can see, how this rolls out over the next little while. The government will say, well, look, it turns out that the only way that we can deal with these issues that have arisen is to resuscitate and revive all of the things you didn't want us to do over the last 7 years. I think that would be disappointing but not surprising, as I said.
Thanks, Jim. I'm particularly concerned about the superannuation policy, and I think one of my biggest concerns about that is the disproportionate impact it's going to have on women who have lower super balances to start with and are more likely, it will take a much bigger hit over the long term if they withdraw that money now. One of the things that has concerned me for some time is the complete lack of a gender lens on any of the decisions taken by this government. And I think that was most amusingly revealed with the suggestion that hairdressers could open, but only for 30 minutes at a time. There were clearly no women in the room when they made that decision. But I think Labor has done a good job, Tony Burke in particular, standing up before the JobKeeper payment and saying, look, you cannot cut part-timers out of this. That's going to disproportionately affect women as well. But a lot of the key workers that we're seeing and the industries that we're seeing at the forefront of this crisis are those that are dominated by women. They're nurses, they're teachers, they're childcare workers, they're aged care workers, they're retail workers that have been laid off and probably don't have access to JobKeeper. I wonder, this is my own pet issue, as you know, and I know you've mentioned it yourself in Parliament recently. How do we create a society that better values women's work and care work when we come out the other side of this? Because we've seen that they are the critical workers, and yet they're the most amongst the most low paid in our society.
Yeah, I think this crisis has really made us reconsider all of the things and all of the industries and all of the types of workers that we consider to be essential. And I think if there's one common, ingredient to all of the speeches given in the Parliament by Tony, as you said, but Brendan O'Connor and Anthony Albanese and others, is that there is a recognition, I think, in our team that at this moment, people are finally realising the issues in the labour market with the way that women's work is paid, or industries dominated by women is paid, what we consider to be essential, what we truly value. And I think the task for us, for really all of us, is to make sure that this moment isn't seen down the track as some kind of historical quirk, something that we observed as a kind of an interesting kind of, short-term oddity, and we need to do something about it. And superannuation as well. I mean, the idea that a self-respecting, first world, first-rate country like ours would be churning out these kind of outcomes in super. It should be abhorrent to us that women retire with little over half as much as men in the workplace. So, this needs to be an enduring concern and not just something that we consider, kind of an interesting oddity.
Yeah. Good to hear, Jim. I'll be making sure, I'll be holding you to that. We've got a few ideas at Per Capita. And again, to give us a shameless plug, we put a report out just before all of this crisis started to really hit around International Women's Day on the state of gender equity in Australia. And we looked in depth there at the impact of low paid and unpaid care work on women's financial security, amongst a whole heap of other measures. And we're going to be doing some more work on that soon. So hopefully we've got some ideas that can help you along.
Great.
I know Michael Tull is on the line from the CPSU and has a really interesting question to put to you. So I'm going to throw to Michael now.
Thanks, Emma. G'day, Jim, and everybody else. Really simple question, Jim, just around the role of the public service, both in providing the advice and services to deal with what's happening now, but also the role of public sector employment, direct employment in particular, going forward as we try and fight our way out of what's going to be an ugly recession.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. And can I just take the opportunity as well to thank you for all the work we did in the last term of the Parliament together when I had the finance and the public sector portfolio. One of the tragedies of May 18 was not being able to work with you on some of those issues, because we are seeing now, the need for, a really professional, well-resourced public sector. And we're seeing, frankly, the costs of all of this hollowing out that's happened over the last few years in particular. If this won't help Australians reconsider, the importance of our Centrelink workers, the importance of our, policy advisors and policy makers, all of the frontline workers employed by all levels of government, then I'm not sure what will. I think there is a regard for the public sector right now, and a bit like the answer to Emma's question about gender equality, I think we need to make this something that is recognised in perpetuity, and not just as a sort of a spike in interest as people line up outside Centrelink and wish there were, wish things were quicker, or are on hold on the phone and wish things were quicker. This needs to be something that we recognise into the future. If you think about what Phil Lowe said about the long tail of unemployment that we're facing in Australia, most likely over the next couple of years in his estimation, then clearly, we've got to get the private sector economy growing, but we've also got to make sure that we've got a well-resourced public sector too.
Yeah. I know Angela Jackson is on the line from Equity Economics, and she had a really interesting piece in the what are now known as the 9 papers in The Age in Melbourne the other day about these issues around debt and what we need on the other side. So, Ange, do you want to jump in here?
Oh, thanks, Emma. Yeah, look, thanks, Jim, and thanks everyone for what is a really interesting and timely discussion about where we're headed and what the economic response is going to need to be. I guess, Jim, I'm interested in your comment about the debt, and I know politically that this is going to be a problem for us going forward for the Labor Party. I guess it's this question, isn't it, about what the value of the spending is, and maybe trying to change that discussion and how we change that discussion from it being about debt or not debt to about the quality of the spending. Because as we go forward into the recovery, we're going to see, I think, from the government, some high quality spending and some not so high quality spending. What are your thoughts about that, about how we, I guess, change the narrative about government spending away from this debt question to about the quality of the spend and about the type of society and economy that we want to create?
Yeah, absolutely, Ange. Thanks for that question. I think that's it goes to a couple of things that are really kind of near and dear to me. First of all, obviously, the whole kind of bang for buck side of things is one of the reasons why we've set up this committee with Katie Gallagher, so that we can have some parliamentary oversight of the spend that's happening right now. I think that's really important for transparency and accountability, and so that things can be, fixed and tweaked as we go. So that's sort of part of the bang for buck argument, but that's the kind of near-term argument. I think it's also the case as we look to, over time, reducing the level of debt on the Commonwealth's balance sheet, that we need to work out, not just in terms of government spending and investing, but also, changes, whether it's changes to revenue or, changes to spending patterns, that we are, that we're getting the best sort of available economic outcomes and societal outcomes out of that as well. But really the main thing I wanted to say about your question is, we need to get much, much better at measuring what we really care about in the budget and in the economy. I believe that we should continue to measure, the GDP growth and the unemployment rate and hours worked in the economy, and all of those traditional measures, I think, are absolutely critical that we continue to rely on those for part of the picture of the economy. But that shouldn't prevent us also measuring what else matters to us, whether it's intergenerational issues that Emma talked about before, whether it's health outcomes, whether it's environmental outcomes. We need to get much better at working out, when we're making a public investment or making any kind of decision in the budget or the economy, we need to weigh up a whole range of factors. And the only way to do that is if we get much more effective at agreeing as a country, or at least as a government, what matters most to us, what are the kinds of things that tell us whether we're going well or going badly as a country, whether we're progressing down the right path or the wrong path. And once we determine that, then measuring success against those criteria as well, and not as well as the traditional criteria, not instead of the traditional criteria. And I know that the operation that you work for, Ange, and probably a range of people on the call, have got an interest in that. I mentioned it a few months ago in another forum, and it's just been absolutely phenomenal, the feedback that people have had about how they engage with working out, engaging with that project to work out what matters and how we measure it. So I think one of the things that we need to do in this recovery, not just the kind of individual policy decisions, which will be crucial, of course, and not just measuring along traditional lines, which also matters as well, as I said, but trying to work out how we make this part of policy making and policy monitoring and evaluation going forward, so we do get maximum value for money, and not just along the narrow confines of the old ways we've thought about it.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Ange, too, for a really provocative question there. There's a gentleman called Peter Want on the chat. I think he has an interesting question for Jim around essential services, some of the things we've been talking about today. Peter, are you there?
Yeah.
Hello. Can you hear us?
You?
Yes, hello. There you are.
Yes.
Did you want to pose your question to Jim?
Hello, Jim. Was that the one about nationalisation that I put in?
It was, yes.
Yes, Jim. We've heard an outright denial from Prime Minister Morrison about nationalisation of anything. I'm just wondering how your party's looking at this when we come out with essential services towards the end.
Yeah, well, I think it's it should be a tool available to governments in crisis times. If if there's an emergency like there is right now with Virgin Australia, for example, then it should be an option for the government to take an equity stake in the business, or other kinds of support with conditions attached, so that you can recoup that public investment at some future stage. And so I'm not a sort of an enthusiastic kind of nationaliser of businesses, but I think when things are as dire as they are right now, and we're looking at 16,000 Virgin Australia jobs, then it should be one of the things that the government is considering. And I think that their reluctance to do so means that for those 16,000 workers, there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. That's why Anthony and Catherine King and other colleagues of mine have been saying, don't be so stubborn on taking an equity stake. That might be one of the ways that we get the airline through a period which is difficult because of a government restriction that's been placed on them. So it's a pretty extraordinary development. More broadly, as I said, I don't think we should be going through a list of businesses and working out how to renationalise them. But in crisis times, there's a call for it. I think what we saw during the GFC was even the UK government nationalised some of their finance sector companies, and from memory, they made quite a bit of money on it when they reprivatised it. So, there are all kinds of models. The government shouldn't be ruling them out in crisis times.
Thanks, Jim. Ed Miller from GetUp, you had a question that I think could be quite an interesting one. Are you there to ask Jim your question?
Yeah, thanks, Emma, and thanks for doing this, Jim. I'm glad to see you still chucking on the collared shirts, although I think that a lot of us would forgive you if you're in tracky dacks some of these days during a crisis like this. Really loved your piece in The Guardian, thinking about a different sort of future beyond the crisis and how it's not too soon to be envisaging that. And one of the bits of thinking that's obviously been coming out of the Labor Party recently is some interesting thoughts from people like Andrew Lee and Wayne Swan and yourself about what we actually mean when we talk about full employment and what an appropriate target is for getting people back into, decently paid work, whether that number's, 4%, as this government kind of celebrates, or if it should be a bit more ambitious than that. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what you think some of those targets should look like and what you think some of the policies might be both during and after the crisis that push us closer towards that goal.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ed. And that's it's a key kind of conversation that that Brendan O'Connor and others are leading in our team. What does full employment look like in the modern economy, and how might we help get there? Because we all recognise that one of the reasons why we've got historically stagnant wages for some period now is because there's so much underutilisation in the labour market. I think Claire O'Neill's done some good thinking on that, in addition to the colleagues that you rightly identified. We won't get wages moving unless we get that underutilisation issue, dealt with. And one of the most confronting numbers out of Governor Lowe's speech yesterday, I thought, was that the hours worked in the economy are going to take about a 20% hit over the first half of this year, and that goes to some of the other issues we were talking about with underemployment. Look, this is a work in progress for us. Clearly we want to make jobs central to the recovery, but I don't want to kind of preempt some of the work that the other colleagues are doing, except to say that we've made it very clear, Anthony has and everyone else has, that the highest priority is job creation. We can't go on as we've been going for the last 7 years, relying so heavily on insecure work. We can't go on in a IR system which has been delivering consistently stagnant wages, because if we want to get demand going in the economy again, we've got to have people have to have spending power, and they haven't had that for a long time now.
Thanks, Jim. One of the challenges I think we've been reflecting on a bit at Per Capita, and one thing I do want to say was we were planning a big summit, as you know, you were going to join us for, to mark the 75th anniversary of the Curtin government's white paper on full employment, which is on the 29th of May. Obviously that won't be going ahead, but we are looking at doing some online activities around that, and we'll be putting out our own thoughts on how we can achieve full employment in the years ahead in a low carbon economy, in a way that will also allow us to address climate change, because I think that's really critical. But I think one of the challenges that we've been reflecting on recently is, while Australia, along with New Zealand, looks to be quite well positioned to come out of the immediate health crisis more quickly than a lot of other advanced economies, and that should give us theoretically an advantage in terms of rebuilding our economy by providing support and materials and things that other countries are going to need to rebuild. We've actually got a really big lack of complexity in our industrial base. So we're very reliant on resource exports, on tourism, on education. And those are three sectors that are going to take a particularly big hit. I'd just like to get your thoughts on what we need to do and how we can get some more complexity into our industrial base, revitalise our manufacturing capacity, for example. I mean, the fact that we rely on those international supply chains for some fairly essential goods has become really obvious during this crisis. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, first of all, on those three industries that you mentioned, yes, tourism and education exports are taking a stupendous hit for all of the obvious reasons, but the resources sector has actually been one of the things we got going for us, and so I think that is a reminder that we can build a future economy without abandoning our kind of traditional strengths, because some of the sectors of our economy now are actually performing quite well, thankfully. Iron ore, for example, has been doing extremely well in the last little while, and that's helped to alleviate some of the pain elsewhere. So it's a sector by sector challenge. Some sectors are obviously taking a massive hit, as I said. I think it's really shone a light on that lack of complexity, that sort of lack of breadth in the economy that we have at the moment, this crisis. There's that kind of famous Harvard study about complexity in economies, and we typically perform quite badly in their assessment of how complex or how kind of broad an economy is. And so that's obviously something that we need to be conscious of addressing. And when it comes to manufacturing, I mean, clearly there's an appetite in the Australian community for us to have a deeper and broader manufacturing sector. That's one of the things that people are taking out of this crisis, and not just in terms of the manufacturing of PPE equipment for the health sector, but more broadly. And I think one of the things to recognise there is, even though in some sectors the kind of switch has been turned off for the time being, it's not easy just to flick a switch and turn a sector of the economy on, or to turn it on more substantially. And so when we think about manufacturing, we need to think more broadly about what are the components of being good at manufacturing. Clearly we've underperformed on R&D and commercialisation. That's a big issue, and I think Kim Carr's got an op-ed in the paper today which outlines some thoughts there. Clearly we don't, our training is not sufficient for some of the high-end manufacturing that we want to get into. Clearly energy costs are a massive part of the equation here. And for those people on the call who follow, the work of Ross Garnaut, for example, it's possible to read that book, not to agree with every single page, but his overall argument that, we have a chance in Australia to get our energy costs way down, and to make that some of the things, one of the advantages that our sectors, including manufacturing, enjoy, rather than one of the problems and challenges that we have to overcome. And that's a good thing too. So we need to look at manufacturing more broadly. We need to have those kind of pillars of manufacturing in place, so that we can become the more diverse, broader, more complex economy that we need to be.
Thanks, Jim. I'm getting a lot of pressure from those on the line today. We've addressed sort of some of the thoughts around job guarantees and the debate around debt and the modern monetary theory issue, but I'm getting quite a few people saying, what do we think about a universal basic income? Now I'm on the record, and I got attacked by a lot of people on the left for not being left enough when I said I didn't think a UBI was the way ahead, for various reasons. I'm just interested in getting you to respond to that, because there are a lot of people here that think that might be the way forward.
Yeah, and I understand that, Emma. I've sort of tried to engage as much as I can on social media and emails to the office on this issue. I think a lot of people who are arguing for a UBI are arguing for it from quite a good place. You know, they're worried about the future of work. They're worried about what technology is doing to workplaces. I'm a bit more optimistic about technology than many people are, but I can understand where people are coming from. And I think in particular, when they see the kind of carnage in the job market at the moment, when they recognise that that's falling disproportionately on, you know, vulnerable people, young workers, workers in industries which were already, where employment was already pretty insecure, I can understand why people come at this issue. But the reason I don't support it is the U bit in universal basic income. And obviously it's the role of government to provide a basic income when people need it. But the universality for me is the problem. Yeah. Because I think one of the things we've got going for us, it's not sufficient when we come to, you know, some of the payments, but, you know, a targeted social security system, in my view, is a good thing, because it means you can give more support to people who need it more. And the flatter you are with the basic income that you provide, the less you can provide the most vulnerable people. And so I think it falls at that hurdle. Yeah. But I mean, I certainly recognise a lot of people are keen on it. There's examples around the world, obviously, where they're having a crack at it. And obviously we monitor that really closely. But no, I'm not an enthusiast.
No, look, and I'm with you. It's the U part that I have a problem with as well. I think the basic income part for anyone who can't work for whatever reason, and that should include caring responsibilities and other issues. If they need that government support, it should be there, and it shouldn't be as hard to get it as it has been. And people certainly shouldn't be demonised the way they have been for needing that. I was pleased to see you say that in Parliament recently, that we should move away from the dole bludger rhetoric. But one of the things about the UBI for me is I don't think it's radical enough. I think it's essentially a way of putting cash into people's pockets to spend on private enterprise, and it would also undermine the case for public services. I'm a lot more interested in universal public services than I am in universal income. Last time for one more question, and I'm going to throw to Janet McCalman at the University of Melbourne. I'm not sure if she's there with John Langmore. I know they're both on the line, but Janet, I think you had an interesting historical parallel to raise.
Yes, and Jim has actually alluded to this in what he's been writing. Oh, sorry, you mean about UBI? Yes, no. All right. Well, look, the UBI has been tried. The Roman Empire, and was essentially run with the UBI. It didn't end well. The Speenham system in the late 18th century to keep up the wages of impoverished and increasingly immiserated agricultural labourers didn't end well. Long term, it is a disaster for those individuals who are trapped in it. It's a poverty trap, and it's a poverty trap for the nation. I fully agree with Emma. We'd be looking at putting in public services, and I'd love to see a national education service as well as a national health service.
Thanks, Janet. Jim, do you want to respond to that quickly?
I was hoping to hear Judith's historical point too.
Yeah, Janet, you were going to make a point earlier about the history of how we've responded to crises.
Yes, well, the thing that the events we can take great hope for is the world, in particular Europe's recovery after World War II. And the world was in a far worse place in 1945 than we will be. And it turned out to be possible. And they actually built, for a period, a society that was better than it had ever been before, and in many ways has been since. And so it is possible, and it was done through increasing investment. In the way that they paid for the war, they kept spending and thinking about rebuilding their whole welfare structure and their industry. So we did it in Australia, but just looking at Europe, that gives us a lot of hope that it is possible. The thing that worries me is that what we're hearing from the science is that this COVID will be with us for decades. It's not likely that there will be a safe vaccine. There's never been a vaccine developed for a coronavirus of any kind. There's still none for the HIV. So we're probably going to face, as they did with plague for 300 years in Europe, repeated epidemics. And so what we've also got to think really hard about is the sort of deep resilience that we build into the community. And what this crisis has shown us is where our big weak spots are, which are insecure work, which are not investing in the people who do the essential work, which are not giving a health system which is resilient, but is designed to reward a small group of doctors with extraordinary incomes. And so I think that one of the thinking around all of this has to be in a bigger scale, that we're into a new age now, the epoch of pandemics in the midst of a climate emergency. And this puts it all into a much more dangerous frame, which I certainly don't think the Morrison government has got any capacity to respond to.
Thank you, Janet. We are running slightly over time, so I'm going to invite Jim to just respond to that quickly before I wrap things up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Janet, for both of those contributions. One of the most interesting things I've read in the last little while, which sort of goes to your second set of observations, is that Jared Diamond book about sort of national crises. The guy who wrote Guns,
Yep.
Germs and Steel. It was recommended to me by Bill Shorten, which I'm grateful for. And you read that and you sort of get a sense of the long sweep of, you know, countries and regions dealing with these massive crises. And you know, whether it be, you know, some kind of nuclear event, you know, or whatever it might be, in our case, pandemics at the moment, then, you know, it is, you know, countries, in his words, have to have the kind of ego strength, the sense of identity to deal with some of these issues. And I think one of the sort of genius of Curtin and Chifley during World War II is that at the end of 1942, Curtin goes to Chifley and says, let's set up post-war reconstruction. The war still had a couple of years yet to run. He made Chifley, who was the treasurer and had enough on his plate, the Minister for Reconstruction at the beginning of 1943, which is pretty amazing when you look back at it. And, you know, the way that they put the thought into full employment, what became the white paper on employment, which is just one of the seminal works in the modern history of this country, as you would know better than me. And so I think that, you know, I'm reluctant to kind of pretend that every challenge is like the challenge that we've faced before, but I think there is a lot we can learn from that historical period. And as you rightly point out, not just Australia and our response, but the kind of global aftermath of World War II, there are lessons in that too for us more broadly.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Janet, getting a fantastic response to your comments here on the stream. And Janet and I will have more to say on these issues shortly, to be a little bit cryptic. And I think there's a lot of people saying they'd like to hear more from Janet. And I'd like to throw out publicly right now to Peter and the team at Essential that I'd be very happy to host another chat with Janet sometime in the near future. But that is all we've got time for today, everyone. We could probably keep this going for another hour easily, I think. Thank you so much, Jim. You've been really generous with your time and your thoughts. And I am looking forward to the day when you are in charge of the nation's purse strings. I think it will be a massive improvement for all of us. I'd like to acknowledge the Australia at Home partners, Essential Media, Principal Co, Australian Communities Council and the Centre for Australian Progress. I'd also like to thank The Guardian for publishing the piece that they had from me today to flag this event and talk a little bit about how we should think about debt. Tomorrow, Australia at Home will be talking about disinformation with QUT's Axel Bruns and Tim Graham. And they're going to be releasing some groundbreaking research on coordinated efforts to spread conspiracy, which we're seeing a lot about at the moment during this pandemic. So I urge you all to sign up for that one. Thank you very much for joining us today. One final note, that anniversary of that seminal Curtin white paper is coming up at the end of May. Per Capita's summit to mark that will be postponed to later in the year, but we will be doing some online activities to mark that date. And also, as I said earlier, putting out our own research around how we can achieve a full employment, low carbon economy. And if I can be absolutely shameless, we are a small non-profit think tank. If you want to make a tax-deductible donation to Per Capita, we'd be very, very grateful. But at the very least, jump on our website, subscribe to our newsletter, and you'll find out about all this in future. Thanks again, Jim. and see you later, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.